In the mid-1800s, New York City was home to some of the most violent street gangs in American history. And among the most infamous names was one that sounds almost ridiculous today: the Dead Rabbits. According to the popular story, they were an Irish Catholic gang that fought a brutal street war against the anti-immigrant Bowery Boys in the notorious 5 Points neighborhood. But there's a problem. The more you look into the history, the less certain it becomes that the Dead Rabbits ever existed as an actual gang at all. So how did one of New York's most famous gang names become part of history? And why did a dead rabbit supposedly become their symbol? To understand the mystery, we have to go back to 5 Points. During the 19th century, 5 Points was considered one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York City. It stood in Lower Manhattan at the intersection of 5 streets on the former site of a freshwater lake called Collect Pond. That pond had once provided downtown residents with drinking water and fish, but in 1811 it was filled in to make way for development. The result was a crowded, impoverished neighborhood that eventually became notorious for disease, crime, unemployment, violence, and extremely high population density. By the middle of the 1800s, 5 Points was being compared with some of the worst neighborhoods in London. And in this environment, street gangs flourished. One of the most famous was supposedly the Dead Rabbits. If you've seen Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York, you already know the legend. The movie presents Leonardo DiCaprio's character, Amsterdam Villan, as the son of Priest Villan, the leader of the Irish Catholic Dead Rabbits. Priest Villan is killed by his rival, William Bill the Butcher, Cutting, the leader of the Anglo-Protestant natives. Amsterdam then spends years seeking revenge. In one of the movie's most memorable moments, he hangs a literal dead rabbit in the middle of 5 Points. The message is clear: the Dead Rabbits are back. But while Scorsese's movie is heavily fictionalized, there really was a group associated with the name, or at least there may have been. And that's where things get complicated. According to the traditional version of the story, the Dead Rabbits were active in 5 Points from the 1830s through the 1850s. Police reportedly referred to them as the Bowery Boys because Mulberry Street was part of their territory. The story says the group originally began as the Roach Guards, a gang that protected liquor merchants in Lower Manhattan. Eventually, however, the group supposedly moved into robbery and murder. And despite the strange name, the Roach Guards had nothing to do with actual roaches. The group was reportedly named after its founder, Ted Roach. Then comes the strange part of the Dead Rabbit story. According to legend, during a tense meeting between different factions of the Roach Guards, someone threw a dead rabbit into the middle of the room. Some members supposedly interpreted the rabbit as a bad omen. They left the organization and formed their own gang, the Dead Rabbits. The legend even claims that the new gang carried dead rabbits on pikes, using them as both symbols and weapons. Their biggest rival was supposedly the Bowery Boys, an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic gang led by the real William Bill the Butcher. Poole was notorious for his brutality. Stories about him describe a fighter who was willing to bite noses, attack eyes, and beat opponents mercilessly. The Bowery Boys were also associated with the Know Nothing political movement, a secretive and strongly anti-immigrant organization. For years, the Bowery Boys and the supposed Dead Rabbits fought for control of the streets. And these weren't always small street fights. The violence could become so intense that police and even state militia units struggled to control it. One of the figures supposedly feared by the Bowery Boys was a woman known as Hellcat Maggie. According to stories surrounding her, Maggie had sharpened teeth and wore long claw-like brass fingernails. Much of her story is surrounded by mystery, but she became one of the colorful figures associated with New York's legendary female gang members. And the gangs weren't only fighting each other, they also served political interests. Politics in New York during this period could be extremely corrupt. Political organizations sometimes relied on gangs to intimidate voters, threaten opponents, stuff ballot boxes, and even use violence or murder to influence elections. Then came July 4th, 1857. What began as an ordinary confrontation between the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits reportedly exploded into a massive 2-day gang war. While New Yorkers were celebrating the 81st anniversary of American independence, the Bowery Boys marched towards their rivals' territory. The fighting continued for hours. The next morning, both sides called in allied gangs, and the conflict grew dramatically. By around 10 a.m., reports claimed that as many as 1,000 gang members were fighting in the streets of 5 Points.
People were beating one another with clubs and other weapons. A police officer entered the chaos and ordered the fighting to stop. Instead, he was knocked down, stripped of his uniform, and beaten with his own nightstick. Somehow, he managed to escape, return to the police station, and request backup before collapsing unconscious. A small police force was sent in, but it was quickly overwhelmed. Contemporary reports described bricks, bats, stones, and clubs flying through the streets, while firearms were also being brandished. Wounded people were lying on sidewalks as the fighting continued. Eventually, after roughly 48 hours, the 8th and 71st New York State regiments were brought in. They finally managed to stop the violence. Several buildings had been burned, more than 100 people were injured, and 8 people lost their lives. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Dead Rabbits themselves denied taking part in the riot. After the violence ended, a notice appeared in the New York Times, supposedly on behalf of the Dead Rabbits. The statement claimed that the members were not thieves and had not participated in the fighting with the Bowery Boys. Instead, it said the conflict had involved the Roach Guards of Mulberry Street and the Atlantic Guards of the Bowery. The statement even insisted that the Dead Rabbits were sensitive about their honor and would never allow a thief to become a member. It sounds strange today, a street gang taking out a newspaper notice to defend its reputation. But that was only the beginning of the mystery. American historian Tyler Anbinder has argued that the Dead Rabbits may never have existed as a distinct gang. According to this interpretation, reporters after the riots relied heavily on accounts from members of the Bowery Boys. And the Bowery Boys may have used Dead Rabbits as an insulting nickname for their rivals, the Roach Guards. The insult then caught on. Newspapers repeated it, later writers repeated it, and eventually the name became accepted as historical fact. But what did Dead Rabbits actually mean? According to slang from the period, rabbit could describe a rowdy person and could also have associations with thieves. And the word dead could be used to mean extremely or very. So Dead Rabbits may simply have meant something like very rowdy thieves. In that interpretation, it wasn't the name of a gang at all. It was an insult created by their enemies. There's another possible source of confusion too. The Irish word rabad sounds remarkably similar to rabbit, especially when spoken with an accent. In Gaelic, the term referred to a large or hulking person, so the phrase could potentially have carried another meaning entirely. And if the Bowery Boys were trying to portray their Irish Catholic rivals as dangerous outsiders, a nickname like that would have been useful propaganda. That interpretation also explains why locals may have rejected the name, while newspapers adopted it. Even the famous story about a dead rabbit being thrown into a gang meeting may be nothing more than a later invention. Anbinder has called that story essentially fabricated. His reasoning is simple. If someone had actually thrown a dead rabbit into a room full of working-class Irish immigrants in 1850s New York, they might have been far more likely to cook it and feed it to their families than treat it as some mystical omen. And the notice from 1857 creates even more problems for the traditional story. The notice itself appears to distinguish the supposed Dead Rabbits from the Roach Guards, the very group that historians believe may have actually existed. So after more than 170 years, we may have been telling the wrong story. The Dead Rabbits became famous through books, newspapers, popular culture, and eventually Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. But the historical reality may be much stranger. Perhaps there never was a gang called the Dead Rabbits. Perhaps there was only the Roach Guards, a real organization that was given a humiliating nickname by its enemies, and that nickname survived long after the people who created it were gone. Scorsese later considered returning to this world in a television series based on the same source material, although that project was eventually abandoned. Whether that series would have offered a different version of the Dead Rabbit story remains unknown. So after all these years, one question still remains. Did the Dead Rabbits really exist? Or was one of America's most famous gang names simply an insult that history accidentally turned into a legend? Maybe the most fascinating part isn't that the Dead Rabbits disappeared. Maybe it's that they may never have existed in the first place.